If I told you a country's population was mathematically having itself every single generation, you'd probably assume they were fighting a devastating existential war.
Right, you'd picture collapsed infrastructure, borders under siege, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But what if I told you that country is actually, sunny, peaceful Malta?
Welcome to our deep dive. Whether you are a policy wonk analyzing market trends, an economics student, or just someone trying to understand the reality you'll be living in over the next few decades, today's mission is crucial for you.
It really is. We're essentially examining the foundation of modern society here.
Yeah, and the engineering report is basically signaling a systemic failure.
We often look at these centuries-old institutions, grand government buildings, or legacy welfare states, and we just assume a certain permanence.
Right, like they'll always be there.
Exactly. You admire the stonework of the facade and assume the foundation is rock solid. But structural engineers know the most critical shifts happen deep underground. They are entirely invisible, right up until the moment the building buckles. And that is exactly what we are seeing with global demographics right now. We are pulling our insights today from a really fascinating May 2026 strategic dossier published by Rari.
Yeah, the title translates to Birth Rate Collapsing in Europe, Distrust and Precariousness Behind the Decline.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because for years, global institutions and policymakers brushed off falling birth rates using this very clinical, soothing term.
Oh, the demographic transition.
Right, the demographic transition. The prevailing theory was that this is just a predictable evolutionary step for developed nations. Like a society gets wealthier, people prioritize education and careers, and they naturally just have fewer kids.
And it was always framed as a plateau, not a plummet, which, was an incredibly convenient narrative for political leaders.
Because it required absolutely zero urgent action.
Exactly. It treated demographic shifts as this passive, benign event. But the 2024 data highlighted in this dossier totally shatters that complacency.
Yeah, Europe hasn't just transitioned to a new normal. It has entered a structural demographic contraction.
Which is no longer just a cultural shift. It is a massive economic, industrial, and geopolitical crisis. And it's going to dictate market realities for the rest of the century.
So to understand the gravity of this, we really need to establish a baseline metric that demographers use. A society needs a birth rate of 2.1 children per woman just to maintain its current population size.
Right. The 2 replaces the parents, and that 0.1 basically accounts for natural mortality before individuals reach reproductive age.
Yeah, so that 2.1 is the absolute floor for simply treading water. And the terrifying part, nobody in Europe is hitting it.
Not a single country. Even the nations historically considered the continent's demographic anchors are falling far, far below replacement levels.
I mean, the dossier lays out the current landscape and the numbers are brutal. Montenegro is at 1.75, Bulgaria at 1.72.
Albania at 1.64. And then you look at France, which has spent decades building these incredibly strong state-sponsored family policies. They slid down to 1.61.
Wow. And the UK and Portugal are sitting at 1.41. And Germany, which is basically the industrial engine of the entire European bloc, they are down to 1.36.
It's staggering when you look at it all laid out like that.
But let's look at the extreme end of the data spectrum for a second. Because the dossier brings up Ukraine, which dropped to a staggering 0.99 children per woman in 2024.
Down from 0.9 in 2022.
Right. But wait, I have to push back here. Isn't Ukraine's low birth rate simply because they are fighting a devastating, all-consuming war? I mean, you can't really use an active war zone to prove a broader macroeconomic theory, can you?
What's fascinating here is that the historical data actually tells a much longer story. Yes, the war is undeniably a catastrophic accelerant. Emigration and economic mobilization have basically hollowed out the current generation.
Right. Millions of people displaced or conscripted?
Exactly. But the dossier explicitly points out that the last time Ukraine actually hit that 2.1 replacement level was in 1986, under the Soviet Union.
Oh, wow. Wait, really? 1986?
Yeah. The demographic emptying out was structurally underway decades before this current conflict even began. War acts as an extreme catalyst, but it is not the root cause of the continent-wide collapse.
I guess that makes sense. Because if war was the prerequisite for demographic collapse, the rest of the continent would be stable. But look back at peaceful countries. Like we said earlier, Malta is dropping to 1.01.
Spain is down to 1.10. Italy is at 1.18.
Right, and there are no tanks rolling through Madrid or Rome. It's almost like it's not a kinetic war zone keeping people from starting families. It's an invisible economic war.
That is a perfect way to put it. And the dossier captures this by identifying the primary antagonist here. They call it the cost of normality.
The cost of normality. I love that phrasing.
Right, because we aren't looking at a generation that suddenly decided to, buy sports cars and luxury vacations instead of having children.
Yeah, they aren't just blowing their money on avocado toast.
Exactly. We are looking at a fundamental decoupling of wages from the cost of living over the last 40 years. Housing, energy, unstable jobs.
Let's actually break down the mechanics of that decoupling, because in the 1970s or 80s, a single median salary in a developed European nation could generally secure a mortgage, cover energy bills, and support a family.
That was just considered the baseline of a normal adult life.
Yeah. But today, two median salaries often struggle to comfortably cover rent and childcare in a major metropolitan area.
The structural shifts in the economy have just transformed basic milestones into premium luxury items. You've got the rise of unstable short-term contracts, stagnant wage growth relative to productivity.
And the hyper-financialization of the real estate market.
Exactly. Starting a family is now essentially a capital-intensive project. It requires a level of long-term financial stability that simply doesn't exist for a massive swath of the population, at least not until they are well into their 30s, if at all.
So we have to look at the second-order effects of this. If the cost of normality prevents a generation from reproducing, what happens to the macroeconomic machinery when those future workers just fail to materialize?
Well, the dossier points out that European leadership has been operating under this grand illusion. They assume they could essentially outsmart the demographic math.
Right, through a combination of increased worker productivity, rapid automation, and waves of immigration.
They assumed the legacy systems could just endure indefinitely. But think about the modern European welfare state. The public pensions, the healthcare systems, social assistance.
It's not a static savings account, is it?
Not at all. It operates as the generational subscription model. It's essentially a legally sanctioned pay-as-you-go scheme.
Built entirely on a demographic pyramid.
Exactly. The architects in the mid-20th century assumed an ever-expanding base of young, active workers paying high taxes to fund the payouts for a relatively small peak of elderly retirees.
But when the new workers stop showing up, the math fundamentally breaks. Imagine a seesaw where suddenly all the weight is shifted to one side. The model isn't just creaking anymore, the wood is snapping.
You suddenly have a massive aging cohort drawing heavy medical and pension resources from the state. And they are supported by a rapidly shrinking base of young taxpayers.
If you are a sovereign bondholder looking at a nation's debt, you calculate risk based on their future ability to generate tax revenue. If that taxpayer base is halving itself, the nation faces a terrifying choice.
Yeah, you either hypertax the remaining youth, severely cut elderly benefits, or you default.
It's a lose-lose-lose scenario, and the strain isn't just limited to the welfare state, is it?
No, it extends directly into national security. And this is a huge point in the dossier. They bring up the highly urgent case of Poland.
Right, Poland is currently sitting at a birth rate of 1.16.
And Warsaw is acutely aware of the geopolitical pressure on its eastern border. So in response to tensions with Russia, Poland is trying to radically scale up its military apparatus.
They are buying modern weapon systems, expanding the defense industry, the whole 9 yards.
But you run into a brutal logistical paradox here. As geopolitical pressure dictates a need for greater national strength, the demographic reality completely undermines the ability to project that strength.
Because you can allocate billions of euros to purchase advanced tanks and fighter jets. But defense procurement requires human capital.
Exactly. You need young engineers to maintain the systems, young logisticians to supply them, and young soldiers to actually operate them.
So Poland is looking at a future where they simply do not possess the youth cohort necessary to man a large-scale standing army, not without completely draining their civilian economy of its active workforce.
It's a massive vulnerability. So if the domestic math is structurally broken and the foundation is visibly cracking, how are governments actually responding?
Right. If the house is falling down, what's the repair plan?
Well, over the last decade, European nations have basically relied on two major policy levers to try and artificially correct this deficit: immigration and financial incentives.
Let's examine that first lever, immigration. And just to be clear to you listening, we're covering this strictly neutrally, just reporting the tensions highlighted in the source material without taking any political side here.
Right, absolutely.
So if you lack domestic workers, the most immediate mathematical fix is to import them. The dossier outlines how Germany, for example, has heavily utilized migration to sustain its industrial production and compensate for severe labor shortages.
From an industrial and macroeconomic perspective, the logic is entirely linear. Corporate boards and industrial planners look at the spreadsheet and see that factories need labor to maintain output.
And the state needs new taxpayers to keep the pension system solvent.
Exactly. Because significant sectors of the European economy still rely on labor-intensive models, immigration is the quickest, most efficient way to plug the gap.
But the dossier argues that human societies do not operate on purely mathematical logic, which turns this economic necessity into a profound political friction point.
It acts as a major political detonator. There is a distinct disconnect between the elite economic classes demanding workforce expansion and a growing portion of the general public that reacts to rapid demographic changes with acute anxiety.
Right. The local population often points to the strain on municipal social services or fears of wage compression at the lower end of the income spectrum.
Plus concerns over cultural integration and identity. The rise of populist political movements across Europe is a direct reflection of governments struggling to balance these macroeconomic demands with domestic social stability.
Which naturally leads policymakers to search for an alternative domestic solution, one that doesn't trigger that same political friction.
And that brings us to the second major lever, throwing money at the problem. Aggressive, state-sponsored financial incentives.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because countries like France, Hungary, and Poland have basically opened the treasury. They've allocated huge portions of their GDP to cash bonuses, substantial tax breaks for young couples, heavily subsidized loans for large families.
It is a desperate attempt to directly subsidize that cost of normality we discussed earlier.
Yeah. And the dossier highlights Hungary as the definitive case study for this approach, right?
Hungary is the ultimate example. For more than a decade, Budapest has engineered its entire national policy around demographic growth. They set a hard, very public goal. Hungary will reach the 2.1 replacement rate by 2030.
And they threw incredible resources at this. We are talking lifetime income tax exemptions for women with 4 or more children.
State-backed loans that are literally forgiven upon the birth of a third child. Massive housing subsidies.
But evaluating the results of that spending spree reveals the hard limits of fiscal policy. Because in 2024, despite all these structural incentives, Hungary's birth rate is stubbornly stalled at 1.41.
It hasn't moved the needle enough. To put that in perspective, 1.41 is the exact same rate as the UK and Portugal.
Nations that have not deployed anywhere near that level of systemic financial intervention. It fundamentally proves that you cannot simply bribe a population into a baby boom.
The cash is not the cure. The mechanism fails because there is a complete mismatch between the incentive and the reality of the burden.
Right. The state offers a one-off capital injection, say, of €15,000 tax break or a subsidized car loan. But raising a child in a modern developed economy is a 20-year operational expense.
It costs hundreds of thousands of euros, not to mention the compounded opportunity cost for women navigating a highly competitive corporate labor market.
A one-time bonus just doesn't alter the long-term arithmetic.
So if importing the math causes political instability and subsidizing the math fails to alter the trajectory, we are forced to look beyond economics entirely.
So what does this all mean?
The dossier argues that the birth rate crisis is not actually a disease itself. It is the ultimate undeniable symptom of a deeper societal condition. It is a metric of collective trust.
That is heavy. But it makes sense. Choosing to have a child is inherently an act of radical optimism, isn't it?
Absolutely. It requires a baseline belief that the future will be stable, prosperous, and secure. But according to the dossier, European society today is plagued by a pervasive sense of precariousness.
It's not just the financial metrics on a spreadsheet. It's a society-wide inability to confidently imagine a positive future.
You have an entire culture characterized by delayed adulthood. Individuals just feel perpetually unestablished. And when a population loses its foundational optimism, the demographic indicators inevitably flatline.
Which is terrifying when you zoom out.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the global implications are stark. The rest of the world is not just hitting pause while Europe navigates its demographic winter.
Right. While the European continent rapidly ages, accumulates higher debt-to-GDP ratios to fund its legacy welfare systems, and grows increasingly dependent on external actors for energy, raw materials, and labor.
Other regions are surging. Significant portions of Africa and parts of Asia are experiencing sustained demographic growth.
The center of global vitality, consumer demand, and industrial workforce capacity is shifting decisively away from Europe.
And there's a deeply ironic contrast here regarding where European leadership has focused its strategic vision over the last decade.
Oh, the sustainability paradox. The dossier points this out so well. Brussels has directed immense political capital toward the concept of sustainability.
But they framed it almost exclusively through the lens of climate and energy.
Right. They focused on carbon emissions, green transitions, and electric vehicles, which are obviously important. But while the regulatory apparatus was entirely focused on environmental sustainability, a completely different, equally lethal form of unsustainability materialized right beneath their feet.
Demographic collapse. And the fundamental difference is the nature of the solution.
What do you mean?
Well, you can achieve environmental benchmarks through regulatory force. A government can pass a legislative package to ban the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035, or they can issue massive sovereign debt to build a subsidized solar grid. You can regulate industry.
But you cannot legislate trust.
Exactly. You cannot pass a parliamentary decree that forces a generation, conditioned by rolling economic crises and precarious employment, to suddenly feel deeply secure about the next 2 decades of their lives.
Which brings us right back to the image we started with. The grand, centuries-old building with the beautiful stonework facade hiding a foundation that is quietly turning to dust.
That is the current architecture of the European economic and geopolitical model. The continent isn't just, aging gracefully.
Its foundational structures, its pay-as-you-go welfare states, its military readiness, its industrial independence are becoming mathematically and structurally obsolete.
And they are collapsing not from an external attack, but from an unfixable internal deficit of trust. And the mathematics of demography are totally unforgiving.
Because they operate on a multi-decade lag.
Right. The consequences of today's 1.36 or 1.14 birth rates are already locked into the labor markets and pension obligations of the 2040s and 2050s. The die is already cast.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you digest all of this. We've seen the mechanics at play here. If one-time financial bonuses fail to offset the long-term cost of normality and immigration faces profound domestic friction points, the root cause remains clearly psychological.
It is a widespread inability to imagine a secure future.
Exactly. So as we look ahead to the structural realities of the next 20 years, the ultimate challenge for a government isn't just balancing a sovereign budget or restructuring a pension tier. The real question is, how does a heavily indebted state facing a shrinking workforce go about artificially manufacturing hope?
That is the defining policy challenge of our era. And honestly, the data suggests we are still desperately searching for the answer.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Matali Rari dossier. Keep questioning the structural foundations around you, and we'll catch you next time.